And hopefully we won't have any internet issues. And last hour I was lecturing in basic musicianship, and all of a sudden I was disconnected for about 10 or 15 seconds and then was able to reconnect. And it seems like it was a problem at my end. So hopefully that won't happen now. All right. This is my last lecture with you for at least a few weeks until we get to music of India, which I can't wait to talk with you about. I'll tell you why I'm excited about that later when we get to that. I've already told you I really enjoy the topics that we were dealing with over the last couple lectures. We could talk about those all semester. That's not the point of this class, but they are important foundational things for this class. So I hope that you will at times go back and review those notes, especially when you maybe hit a kind of music that you either really like a lot or really don't like. Then go back and look at those principles, the theology, the philosophies there, and think about them and try to evaluate that music that you either are really loving or really hating, and try to evaluate it in the context of those ideas. Realizing that the point of this class is not necessarily for you to find more music to love, although I think you will, and I hope you will. And it's also not for you to sit in judgment of all music that's different from your own music. When I say judgment, I mean negative judgment, but to learn to evaluate. And it is hardest for us to evaluate things honestly and somewhat objectively when we really like them a lot or we really don't like it. So let's say, for example, the very first time I went to Korea, which that was probably 15 years ago, to spend a week teaching at a seminary there. I loved the experience. If you've been around me very much, you know that I love to travel. I love to go to new places, learn and try new things. And if it, obviously I only want to do it if it's the Lord's will, but I'm always thankful when God gives me a chance to go to a new place to teach and minister. And so I went to Seoul, and I didn't like it. I did not like South Korea. I'll just be honest with you. I can't put my finger on why. And by the time I had gone to South Korea, I had been in several countries, and I had been in China actually several times, and I loved China. And you will find that out as we talk about music of China today. I love China, the country, much of the culture, the food, people. There's just a lot about China that I like. And every time I go there, my wife accuses me of just waiting until the Lord lets me leave the Philippines and go live in China. Now that's not ever going to happen, I don't think. The Lord would have to really do something major for that. And I don't think that's his will. But I do like it very much. Seoul, I didn't like, for whatever reason. And one of the things I did not like was the food, which is really amazing because I love exploring food of different places. And I came back and told my wife, I loved the people that I worked with. I loved the ministry, of course. That was really wonderful. Fellowship that I had was great. But I didn't particularly like the city or the country or the food all that much. Then 5 years later, I went back to teach again, and Mrs. B got to go with me, actually. And it was totally different. I really enjoyed it. I actually fell in love with the city of Seoul and fell in love with the food. Really fell in love with the food. So my wife cooks Korean stuff now, a few things. And I don't eat kimchi straight, but I like it mixed in to stuff. So the first time I went, it was hard for me to evaluate the food of Seoul because I really didn't like it. And so my thinking was, oh, the food in Seoul is not as good as the food in China. Well, that's not a very objective way to think. I didn't stop to evaluate. I didn't, think about how should I evaluate this food. It was just my personal response to it. And the temptation for us with music is to let our personal response to a particular kind of music be our guide. And that's always dangerous. You may like it a lot, which is going to cloud your view. You may not like it, and that's going to cloud your view as well. And so I'm going to encourage you to keep going back to those notes and let them be kind of a mental corrective for you, especially about the kinds of music that you find yourself loving and the kinds of music you find yourself hating. And just be suspicious of your own responses. Your own responses are important. Please understand, they are. But they cannot be the only guide to your thinking about any particular kind of music. Well, I better get off of the philosophy now and get to the music of China. So let's go to the Lord in prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this opportunity to again meet and to be exploring the music of many cultures in this part of the world that you have put all of us. Thank you so much, Lord, for the image, your image that you've put in us that helps us to be creators or sub-creators, and that down through the millennia, you have gifted people with the creation of music and some incredible and beautiful and varied forms of music. Lord, help us to also remember that we are fallen creatures and that we often express that sinfulness and fallenness in our artistic creations also. So help us to remember that as we look at the music of many cultures to evaluate, and we'll thank you for it. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, we're going to the music of China, and I do have slides here, so let me get that up and running. I'm going to again ask you to tell me, are you seeing a single slide or are you seeing double slides? One slide, okay, wonderful. I'm going to shut up for a minute. Sorry, that's a rather abrupt end, but just at least a little start into our listening to Chinese music. We're going to be looking at traditional music of China. China is a massive country, as you can see from this map. And if I can, I'm not sure if you can see, you probably can't see my mouse, but if you follow the dotted lines there, you see that China is a massive country, from Russia in the north over to Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and Pakistan on the left, on the west, down to Nepal and Bangladesh and Myanmar, Vietnam, Laos to the south, and then it's all China to the east until you get up to North Korea. So you know that China is a massive country made up of many, many ethnic backgrounds and cultures. It is not a single monolithic culture, although there is a strong, distinct kind of Chinese culture or Chinese mentality that comes through and has been especially encouraged over the past 60 to 70 years. But as we begin our study, it's important to remember it's a massive place. There's many kinds of music, and we are just going to spend 45 minutes talking about one corner of that music, but a very important and influential corner. 23 provinces, and 1.5 billion people as of a couple days ago. And it's increased since then, no doubt. It's a massive place. We are going to be looking at the traditional / classical music of China. There's many other kinds of music in China that I may mention later, but we are focusing on one area that has kind of been established in modern China as Chinese, proper Chinese classical music. And that's what we're going to limit our focus on. There are many other kinds of music in China, but this is the one that is most important for our discussion because it's kind of a dominant musical form, and it's viewed as an expression of what it means to be Chinese. We don't obviously have time to go into the history of China, but Chinese culture dates back a very long time. As a culture. Now you can see there have been many different governments, empires, and whatnot as you look at this list, but there has been a fairly consistent sense of Chineseism, if you will, that other places do not have such a history of. Maybe one of the only other places that has similar history. Is that my computer dinging? I suppose. Pardon me 1 second. Let me exit out and see if I can end that dinging. That's really irritating. Okay. Hopefully that will get rid of the dinging. Okay, so back to, there we go. There are only a few places in the world that have this kind of consistent link of culture. China is one of those, although there was a major break in that we'll talk about briefly. India has had something like this as well, areas in the central part of where Asia and Europe meet. Most other places in the world do not have this kind of strong connection across thousands of years. We don't have that in the Philippines. We don't really have that in North America, in the US. Europe, sort of, but not the same consistent kind of connection that China particularly has. Of all places in the world, maybe we could arguably say that they have this longest kind of consistent connection of what it means to be Chinese, even when Chinese emigrate to other parts of the world and become citizens of other nations. Even here in the Philippines, Chinese have been in the Philippines for some 500 years, maybe longer, but they have maintained a distinctness. Go to Binondo and you know that. Chinoy is Chinese Filipino, not Filipino Chinese. There is a kind of something very strong kind of sense of Chineseness that's not related to politics so much. So the Chinese of Singapore think of themselves as Chinese, but they don't like China, the political entity. Taiwan is Chinese, but they don't love the communist Chinese government. You understand what I mean, okay? Same thing with Chinoys in the Philippines. So, but there is this amazing history. I visited a museum in Shanghai. I'm not saying this to brag, but I have been in China many times over the years. God has given me really unique opportunities to minister there. I won't take time to bore you with all of that, but I have had a privilege of visiting there a number of times. And on one visit to Shanghai, visited a museum that had artifacts dating back to maybe 500 years after the life of Noah. Can you imagine? I saw a small vase that if the way of dating is accurate, and it's hard to know, but if it was accurate, that vase was made maybe 500 years after Noah walked on the earth. That's amazing. I just was kind of in awe looking at that and thinking about that kind of history that has been somewhat maintained. Now, I mentioned that there was a break in that began in the early 20th century and into the beginning of the communist era. And there was a significant break in mainland Chinese culture. And the communist era brought with it not only a political revolution, but a cultural revolution that specifically Mao Zedong in the 1960s initiated something called a cultural revolution. And in that revolution, he sought to purge traditional Chinese thinking and art and culture from the country, as well as Western art. And basically, he wanted to create a whole new way of being Chinese. And that lasted for, if I remember right, about 10 years, 1966 to 1976, I think. It brought incredible upheaval. Millions of people died in the process. And for maybe 40 years, 30, 40 years, Chinese culture was kind of put on pause as they tried to create a whole new Chinese culture. On one of my visits, I got to know a Chinese architect, an unbeliever. He was the son of the lady who was hosting the Bible school that I was teaching in for that week. And he wasn't a Christian, but he didn't mind what his mom was doing, which is really unusual. And he and I got to have lunch together, and we're talking about art in China and whatnot. And he said, you look around China, and other than historical buildings that have not been knocked down, there was no sense of what it means to be Chinese or create Chinese art anymore, or Chinese architecture. He felt, the result of the Cultural Revolution kind of removed a foundation, and they didn't have anything to build on other than atheism and communism and materialism, which those are not terribly good foundations. They create a lot of ugly art, sadly. And that was interesting to hear him talk about that and feel like he didn't have roots in a culture that could guide him in his thinking about art. And after the Cultural Revolution, Chinese began to re-embrace their past, especially in terms of art and philosophy. And they began to be more open to Western musical expressions, and there began to be more of a mix. For the kind of music we're talking about, which began to be re-embraced, we're talking about music that is influenced by Confucianism and the values of Confucianism. And this is not the place to have a full-blown discussion of Confucianism. I'd encourage you to do some reading on your own about that. But there are some basic ideas that we could jot down here. One component of Confucian, before I do that, let me go back here. I'm not looking at my notes. There are several aspects of Confucianism that still influence Chinese thinking. I'll put some of these up in a moment, but they include respect for parents, loyalty to the government, keeping one's place in society. In other words, you are born into a particular place, a particular life, and that is your position in society. Confucian values also include a respect for the group, for others, and for care of the group. And it does also include a cultivation of the conscience and personal character. There's a personal aspect of Confucianism of trying to become a better person. That's all a part of what of Confucian values. Couple ways to look at that. One would be this filial devotion or piety, and included in that often is ancestral worship, especially in traditional Chinese cultures. Taiwan, this is still prominent. Singapore, Chinese cultures outside of mainland China, although some of this is growing back into mainland Chinese, communist China. The humanness, the importance of society, people together, persons interacting together, very important. Ritual, or a consciousness of ritual in life. Not limited to religious ritual, but certainly including that idea. Continual learning is also important. Continuing to learn, knowing one's place in society, and fulfilling the roles of that position. So all of these things are an important part. You could think of Confucian values as a stool with three legs, and the three components there at the top of your slide would be the components of that tripod. But there are other strong aspects of these similar to what I just mentioned. Now, these ideas do relate in some ways to the musical product. As we talked about yesterday, music comes out of what people believe about life, about what's important. And that's certainly true in this case as well. We're not going to draw necessarily very direct lines, but I think you'll see a haze of connection between this and some of the musical ideas that we're going to look at. By the way, I will post these slides, and you'll see websites where you can get more information about some of these ideas. So let's talk a little bit about music philosophy. Going back in time, the traditional classical music of China is very highly theorized, just as music was in ancient Greece. Very careful thought given to what music was and what music was supposed to be and is supposed to be. Kind of a summary statement. Don't try to write this down right now, but it'll be available to you. Philosophically, classical music was understood by Chinese philosophers to be music that harmonizes nature and achieves a certain cosmic alignment. This is the desire behind classical music, to bring people into harmony with each other and with life and with their surroundings. Sounds a little bit similar to the brief comment I made about Beethoven, although they're thinking about it in different terms than Beethoven would have. What they mean by harmony is quite different from what Beethoven meant by it. The highest form of music was intended for personal spiritual development, which accounts for the slow, meditative sound of the typical classical, literati or classical compositions. All well-born, well-educated Chinese would have been taught to compose and play instruments. Now, this is going back in time, but these ideas are still consistent with Chinese classical music today, at least the goals. Widespread musical training for Chinese classical music, I'm not sure if that's still true in Chinese culture today. In terms of specific theory, a couple of things you could note about this. There's a serious pursuit of musical theory and acoustics in ancient China, ancient Chinese thought. I have an acquaintance from Minnesota. He was working on his PhD. This was back around 2012 when I was first starting my doctoral work. I took some classes at University of Minnesota. One of the PhD students there was focusing on medieval Chinese music and philosophy. So he was looking at the thinking that we are talking about, but we're going back even earlier than the medieval period. Serious pursuit of musical theory. They developed a kind of a scientific mathematical view of music, very similar to what the Greeks were doing at the time of Pythagoras. Within thinking about music and the music of China, there are all types of music. There is pop and classical and traditional. There's Western classical, there's religious. We are focusing primarily on the classical and traditional, but when we look at Chinese music, there are many kinds that I already mentioned. I already mentioned the fact that there is a tradition dating back to approximately 1000 AD. The music that we hear in Chinese classical music has its roots going back to about 1000 AD. It's possible that those roots go even further back, but we have no way of really knowing. But there are things that happened around 1000 AD that tie current Chinese classical music to those things. Just as in Western classical music, we tie a lot of what happens in Western classical music to around 1000 AD and the rise of Gregorian chant and Western musical notation. So we have a similar thing going on in China at about the same time. Just an interesting side note, Western music was introduced to China, as far as we know, around 1600 AD. It was banned later during the Cultural Revolution, as I've already mentioned, along with Chinese classical music. But there was an intersection. There began to be more intermingling, Western ideas coming in to China. In the Romantic period of European and Western classical music, there was a fertilization in the other direction, starting to bring some Eastern musical ideas into Western classical music. Maybe some of that was happening earlier, maybe some of that was happening pre-1000 AD, but we can see it clearly in the 1800s in European music and in early and mid 20th century North American Western music. And we do know, because of the size of China and the various cultural groups there and the porous borders, that there was a mingling of instruments and sounds and ideas between China and other countries and other cultures, Mongol and Russian and Indian and South Asian and East Asian. There is a constant mingling. So even some of the primary instruments that are viewed as very Chinese actually were imported from other cultures. It's always important to remember that through history, there is always an ongoing fertilization and cross-fertilization between cultures, even things that we might think of as, like, for example, kundiman. Kundiman is Pinoy, yes? And it is. But it is a musical form that was strongly influenced by European classical songs, art songs of the early Romantic period. Does that make it less Filipino? No, it just is a recognition of the fact that music transcends borders. There's always this going on at all times. That is true for Chinese music as well. And it's important to remember that because you're going to be hearing about music of Vietnam and Japan and cultures around China. And in many ways, we look at the music of those cultures as strongly influenced by China. And that's certainly true. but it's a two-way street and always has been. And so it's good to kind of keep that in mind. In musicology, we can only trace the lines so far back. We don't know fully, but the more we study, the more we find these wonderful intersections between cultures and societies. It's one of the things that makes the study of music and culture so fascinating. A lot of wonderful instruments. Here's just a few of them in Chinese culture. Some of the ones that are often used in orchestras. And I already have been bragging about a few instruments I have, so let me get a couple of them down here. We're out here. I had already shown you this. I'm going to get out of the sharing here for a second. There we go. This is a gourd flute. You can see that the upper portion is actually, it was a plant at one time in its existence. And then we've got bamboo for the pipes. And it has inside it a double reed, two pieces of bamboo, or probably in this case, two pieces of very thin plastic that are tied together. And when you blow air across them, they vibrate. And it sounds something like this. Ah. Well, okay, that's good, but I'm not getting my main. Okay, here we go. Something was stuck in there. Cool sound, huh? I love it. Let me turn on the original sound so you can get a little more clearly. And then the really cool feature of this is pulling out one of these slides. And now this pipe is going to make a drone while I play on the main pipe. Isn't that cool? I love that. This one has two pipes, so that means there's another drone. Different pitch. I don't think they really do this, but you could pull both of them out. Now it sounds like a train. Very cool instrument, very loud, a lot of fun. Another instrument, there are a number of flutes that are a part of China. This is a dongshao, at least that's what I was told that it's called. It's not like the flute in the picture that I showed you. That's a transverse flute that you play this way. This is a vertical flute that you play like this. And unfortunately, I cannot make a sound on it. I've tried. I've gotten a sound out of it once or twice, but you blow across the top. And I can't do it. I wish I could. I should work at it a bit more. Anyway, you can't really see it is open all the way through. It is made out of bamboo. It's really cool to look at, and it is beautiful when you can actually get a sound out of it. Someday this will be in the BGMBC building. All of these will be in the Baccarat collection of Asian instruments at BGMBC. At least that's what they're going to call it after I die. And then the pièce de résistance of my very small collection of Chinese musical instruments. And Ms. Nunez actually can play this a little bit, if I'm not mistaken. This is an erhu, a Chinese violin. Isn't that cool? I'm going to show you a video of the playing of this. The bow The string goes in between the hair of the bow and the wood of the bow. I'm not sure if you can see that. Normally on a violin, you pull the bow across the top of the string. On this one, the bow is in between. Now, sorry, it's pretty squeaky sounding. And then you finger it, you set it on your knee. By the way, there's the bottom with a lizard kind of skin covering it and the sound hole. And it's a beautiful instrument, beautiful to look at, and really wonderful. I wanted one of these for years and was finally able to buy one on one of my trips to Pinyi, and or actually Linyi. Linyi is an industrial area, has these massive warehouses that sell literally everything. All the stuff you buy in Divisoria probably was made or at least shipped out of Linyi in central China. And there was music stores there, and I was able to find an erhu that I could afford to actually buy and bring back. And so when you're back in the building, you'll be able to see that, and maybe you could talk Ms. Nunez into giving you a lesson in how to play the erhu. All right, now let's get back to our slides here and hear a little more music. I haven't played you enough music yet. So these instruments here are common instruments for a Chinese orchestra. Now, the musical elements, I'm going to let you hear them, but a few comments. The melody is everything. In Chinese music, it's all melody, as well as some rhythm, percussion. That's very important. Those are the two key elements to Chinese classical music: melody and rhythm, including percussion, a significant percussion section to a classical Chinese orchestra. There's no harmony to speak of, no counter melodies normally. It's all melody. The key that is used is a type of pentatonic, a 5-note scale, but there are 2 other notes that are used often for modulating from one pentatonic to another pentatonic. Now, Chinese theory recognizes 12 pitches, similar to the Western chromatic scale, but in practice, it's primarily the 5 notes, and then the bending of the notes in between, or like play like I did on this, where I kind of bent a little bit of a note. That's done in Chinese music on flute instruments as well as on the erhu. This is a struck instrument like a zither or a dulcimer. Series of strings across a board, played sometimes with a mallet. But you can hear pentatonic scale, 5 notes. Play the 5 black notes on the piano, and you have a pentatonic scale. Percussion is very important. As I mentioned, you'll see this in a video clip I'll show you in just a moment. And then I mentioned that harmony is not a part of Chinese classical music in general. Rhythm tends to serve the purposes that harmony provides in Western music. Rhythm is used to do some of the same kinds of things in terms of emotion and direction of the music. Opera is a major genre of Chinese classical music. There are 2 major types of opera in Chinese classical: Peking or Jingxi, and Cantonese. Peking would be the northern part of the country, Beijing. Cantonese would be the southern part, Guangzhou, Hong Kong, that part of the country. But there are different types of opera all over the country. Opera was historically a very regional art form. Different songs, different forms, depending on the region of the country you are in. But as China has tried to become more of a monolithic single culture, Peking opera has come to dominate the form. It's made up of very fixed set of stories and characters and musical pieces. It's not something that is created brand new, but it's using fixed ideas. It includes singing and dancing and martial arts. And there are two primary types of melodies in Chinese opera, and colorful costumes are a part of this, and makeup that identifies the characters. I'm going to play about a 3-minute clip here, excerpts from Chinese opera is very long, but here are a few short clips.
青帮动干破，负荆擒罪，数千的过，国泰民安，将相和。
So that gives you a little taste of that. And there's obviously so much more to the genre than we can cover in a class like this. It's a fascinating art form that has its rules and repertoire and ideas and characters and whatnot that date back a very long time, and specific ways of singing, obviously, and speaking that are stylized and a part of what's going on there. Orchestral music is a big part of this, of Chinese classical music as well. So let me play this a little bit here. Again, you notice all the melody instruments are playing the same melody together. Notice the changes of tempo. I wish I could let that keep going. Orchestral music progresses from usually slow and quiet and slowly grows. It follows a pattern of kind of a grand entrance, and then it moves towards quicker tempos, everybody playing together, to then a very grand final conclusion with a lot of percussion going on at the same time. There's other music that I could play examples for. Let me just kind of tap these so you can hear a little bit. This is actually orchestra and choir, and a mix of Western and Eastern. That happens a lot in contemporary Chinese. Music for Western instruments, but in a Chinese style. He's a contemporary Chinese composer. He's written a lot of solo piano music. And then there's also, that's the singing of psalms in a Chinese style that dates back to the 1800s. Let me just zip to the end here. Yeah, sorry. Let me go to the next slide. Okay. Couple final observations, general thoughts about the style. It's very much a fixed or static kind of music. Within Chinese classical music, they're not trying to make up new sounds or develop new ideas or new forms. It's fixed, kind of static. I don't mean that in a negative way, but just instead of always looking for some new idea, the goals of Chinese classical music is the recreation of past musical ideas and trying to do them in a perfect way. So what are some of the key values here? Exact recreation, to make something as it had been made before, at the same level of excellence and beauty, all with an underlying desire, if you will. And so the goals of this music are really the recreation of fixed beauty, rather than trying to create new types of beauty. So there's a high priority on learning and developing techniques that were created in the past, and musical forms, recreating those musical forms, rather than trying to develop new musical forms. Individual personal expression is not a high priority in this kind of music. Interpreting the music for yourself is not really a priority in this type of music. It's more a sense of being a part of this whole musical world that already exists, and you become a part of that whole as an individual musician rather than taking something and making it yours. Like when you do in Western classical music, you might learn a piece of music and you're trying to recreate what the composer did, but you are also infusing yourself into that. That's not really a priority in this kind of music. So different goals for beauty in music with this. And I wish we had more time to talk about that. We could spend an hour talking about that. But there's a great deal of beauty and musical expression here that you can see is tied to some of those earlier Confucius ideas. And we don't have time to evaluate that further, but this gives you at least an introduction to the music. And as you are doing your guided listening, you will, I think, be able to hear and understand more of this as you listen to some of the other examples. I did not post yet a list of questions from yesterday's lecture. I will do that, and we'll post, I forgot, reflections. There's what's called, I did not post reflections for yesterday's. I will do that this afternoon, and I'll post today's as well, and then you'll get a notification from Google Classroom about that. All right, any quick questions before we close? I'm sorry, I've gone a couple minutes late here. If not, then I will end our meeting. Thank you so much.